the lights dim and instead of the engine's sound, a mysterious silence fills the aircraft. The plane begins a rapid descent towards the water as fear manifests in screams among the passengers. The pilot makes several attempts, but the aircraft remains uncontrollable. This is a distressing situation that no one would want to face, and perhaps the plane shouldn't be in this condition. However, a small mistake or oversight can trigger significant problems. There is a lesson to be learned from this incident. This is the narrative of Air Transat Flight 236. But why did this incident occur? Who was responsible for the error, and how many lives were lost? Let's now explore all these details. On the night of August 23, 2001, Air Transat Flight 236, operated by the Canadian airline, carrying 293 passengers and 13 crew members, was preparing to travel from Toronto Pearson International Airport to Lisbon, Portugal. The journey was scheduled to last approximately 7 hours, using the Airbus A330 aircraft. The passengers, excited about their vacations, had no idea that a major incident was about to occur. The Airbus A330, one of the most advanced and highly automated aircraft of the time, had been in operation for 7 years and was considered one of the safest planes in the world. Captain Robert Pizaire, with 48 years old and 16,000 hours of flying experience, led the crew, along with First Officer Dirk Jur, 28 years old with approximately 5,000 hours of experience. After refueling with 48 tons of fuel and boarding all passengers, Flight 236 took off around 9 p.m. In the first few minutes, the aircraft reached an altitude of 39,000 feet and stabilized. The first 4 hours passed without incidents, but approaching the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, the pilots received a strange warning about engine number 2. The warning indicated high oil pressure, low oil quantity, and low oil temperature, an unusual combination. Unable to find information in the operating manual, the pilots contacted Air Transat's Maintenance Control Center in Mirabel, Canada, without obtaining the necessary assistance. Stress in the cabin increased as passengers, unaware of the danger, slept deeply. About half an hour later, the pilots received a new message on the screen, warning of a fuel imbalance in the aircraft's wing tanks. This indicates that there is more fuel in one wing and less in the other. Fuel imbalance in an aircraft is quite rare but not necessarily dangerous, as pilots can correct it by opening the crossfeed valve, allowing excess fuel from one wing to flow into the tank of the other, equalizing the fuel quantity in both wings. However, only 10 minutes after this correction, the pilots receive another warning that there is not enough fuel to reach Lisbon. The situation becomes more serious as the plane is in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and cannot make it to Lisbon. Faced with this fuel shortage, the pilots have no choice but to make an emergency landing at the nearest airport. In this case, the only viable airport is Lodges on Terceira Island, Azores. The pilots immediately communicate with the air traffic control at Lodges Airport about the emergency due to fuel exhaustion. At this moment, there are only 7 tons of fuel remaining on board, representing just 6% of the total capacity. The fuel is depleting rapidly, and the pilots cannot identify the reason. Despite no signs of leakage during the first few hours of flight and no external indications of fuel being discarded, the reality is different. A significant fuel leak occurred from the right side engine of the aircraft due to a collision between a hydraulic pipe and the fuel pipe. This damaged the external coating of the fuel pipe, resulting in a substantial leak. Although the fuel imbalance was a clear indicator of the leak, the pilots, due to a psychological phenomenon known as confirmation bias, did not focus their attention on this possibility. Confirmation bias led the pilots to mistakenly consider that the fuel shortage warnings were due to a computer error, ignoring clear indications such as the fuel imbalance. Even after transferring fuel between the wings, the problem persisted and the fuel was running out quickly. The lack of a system directly indicating the leak forced the pilots to deduce the situation by interpreting various warnings. At this critical point, the plane had only 4.8 tons of fuel, well below the required 17 tons. The pilots tried to contact maintenance control again, but help did not arrive. The idea of performing a fuel leak procedure was considered, but Captain Pish refused it, deeming it risky. At 6:13 in the morning, the right side engine shut down and Captain Pish initiated the descent, giving full power to the left engine. The decision to stay at 39,000 feet proved to be correct. First Officer Dirk de Jager informed air traffic control about the situation. At this critical moment, the plane had only 600 liters of fuel and was 240 kilometers away from Lodges Airport, its destination. For another 13 minutes, the aircraft continued to operate in this manner. However, after this period, the left side engine also shut down due to fuel exhaustion while the plane was still 120 kilometers from its destination. After the shutdown of both engines, the plane lost its electrical power, leaving the pilots with no option but to glide. In this critical situation, the device called the emergency turbine was automatically deployed on the underside of the aircraft. This turbine generated power by spinning, enabling the operation of some essential cabin systems. Captain Pish now had only one remaining option: to glide the plane as far as possible and attempt to reach the nearby Lodges airport. Thus, the lives of the 306 people on board were entirely in the hands of Captain Pish. The cabin was dark due to the power outage. In these conditions, the captain instructed the flight attendants to prepare all passengers for a forced water landing. However, this idea was terrible because even if people survived the impact, the ocean water could pose a deadly threat to their lives. Captain Pish had only one option: to try to glide the plane towards Lodges airport. However, this was a challenging task. The airport was approximately 100 kilometers away, and the descent rate was about 2,000 feet per minute. Given that the plane was at an altitude of 30,000 feet, it meant that it would land in the next 15 minutes, whether the captain could reach the airport or not. Captain Pish faced an incredibly challenging situation. The Airbus A330 was not designed as a glider, and two of the three hydraulic systems were failing, complicating the control of the aircraft's pitch. Additionally, various crucial systems, including wing spoilers, nosewheel steering, and thrust reversers, had also failed. This meant not only that reaching the airport was difficult but also that the control of the aircraft was significantly impaired. Even if they could land the plane on the runway, it would be extremely challenging. The situation was dire, and Captain Pish had to make some critical decisions. At Lodges airport, the tower controller began toggling the runway lights on and off, helping Captain Pish visualize it from a distance. This served a dual purpose, guiding the crew towards Lodges airport and signaling that they were on the right path. Gently gliding the plane was a challenge for Captain Pish. He needed to maintain a speed of at least 140 knots to keep the emergency turbine generating electricity. However, he also had to be careful not to exceed a speed of 200 knots to avoid triggering the landing gear prematurely. Captain Pish faced a new problem as the plane got too close to the airport. His job was to keep the plane as high as possible while gliding, but he had done this too well. The plane was only 8 miles from the airport, but its altitude was 13,000 feet, much too high. Ideally, the plane should be at 3,000 feet at this point. Captain Pish realized that if he tried to descend the plane suddenly, he would lose speed and might not make it to the runway. So, he made a 360-degree turn to descend more gradually. Meanwhile, First Officer Dirk de Jager lowered the landing gear and extended the slats in front of the wings, allowing the plane to fly at a slower speed without creating too much drag. Captain Pish's decision was bold, turning the plane to face the opposite direction of the runway. Passengers believed the plane was going to crash into the water, but about 20 minutes later, when the plane completed a full turn, Captain aligned it with the runway. Although the altitude was still a bit high, it wasn't so high that another turn was necessary. In this way, Captain maneuvered the plane in an S shape towards the runway to increase the distance between the plane and the runway slightly. On the ground, firefighting, ambulance, and rescue teams were prepared and stationed, ready to act in case of an emergency. Due to the lack of flaps, Captain and First Officer could only reduce the speed to 200 knots, while the ideal speed would be around 145 knots. The plane, upon landing, bounced and then touched the runway again, with 8 out of 12 tires bursting. The speed of the plane was very high, making it difficult to decelerate without wing spoilers and engine thrust reversers. When the captain applied the brakes, the plane's tires locked completely, and the plane started skidding on the runway at a very high speed. As the anti-skid system was also malfunctioning, the plane's tires were completely damaged as they skidded on the runway. Surprisingly, the plane finally stopped before the end of the runway. All passengers and crew managed to survive the accident. After landing, according to the captain's orders, everyone was immediately evacuated from the plane. There was a fire on one of the wheels of the left landing gear, but the fire brigade quickly extinguished it. After this dramatic encounter with death, both the pilots and the crew received a warm reception and were seen as heroes. 1 year after the incident, both Captain Robert Pish and First Officer Dirk de Jager received an Airmanship Award from the Airline Pilots Association. However, a few days after the incident, doubts began to arise about how an aircraft flying over the Atlantic Ocean could suddenly run out of fuel. The investigation revealed that if the pilots had followed any fuel leak procedure while heading to Lodge's airport, at least 3.8 metric tons of fuel would have remained in their plane even after landing. However, due to the psychological phenomenon of confirmation bias, the pilots did not understand the fuel leak warnings. The real reason behind the fuel leak was a technician's mistake. Shortly before the flight, during maintenance on the No. 2 engine, a technician mistakenly installed a part intended for another aircraft. This error caused the fuel pipe to rupture, triggering the entire incident. Despite the significant error of the pilots in not recognizing the fuel leak warnings, they received praise for how they handled the situation. 1 year after the incident, both were recognized with an airmanship award. Airbus also implemented significant improvements in the safety of its aircraft, including enhancements to fuel leak indicators. This incident, which occurred 22 years ago, remains one of the most notable in aviation history, highlighting the incredible skill of the pilots in dealing with an extremely challenging situation. So, that was the story of Air Transat Flight 236, which is still considered one of the most notable incidents in aviation history. Did you enjoy this story? Please comment here in the comments. Thank you for watching, and until next time.